The sound that dragged me out of sleep wasn't the usual morning chorus of cattle lowing or the wind rustling through the high pines. It was something sharper, more metallic, hammering, and it was coming from my barn. Now, let me paint you a picture. My ranch isn't exactly easy to access. We're talking miles of dirt track, 3 heavy-duty cattle grids, and enough no trespassing signs to wallpaper a small house. The kind of signs that don't just suggest you stay out, they imply that continuing forward might be detrimental to your health. So the idea that someone was casually starting a construction project in my barn, a structure that has stood on this land for nearly 100 years, felt less like reality and more like a bizarre, stress-induced dream. I pulled on my worn leather boots, the familiar squeak of the leather comforting in the face of the unknown. The air outside was crisp, that high country cold that bites at your lungs, smelling faintly of sagebrush and the damp earth from a storm that had passed through 2 nights prior. The sun was barely cresting the eastern ridge, casting long, distorted shadows across the valley. As I rounded the grove of cottonwoods that separates the main house from the barn complex, I stopped dead. The scene in front of me was so utterly absurd that I genuinely questioned if I was still asleep. There were 6 men, maybe 7, bustling around like an organized anthill. They were unloading massive pallets of pressurized lumber, galvanized shelving units, and stacks of those heavy-duty plastic storage bins you buy at big box stores. A large white diesel truck was backed right up to the main barn doors, which were wide open, gaping like a surprised mouth. These weren't local guys. I know everyone within a 30-mile radius. These men wore matching bright blue polo shirts with some kind of embroidered logo on the chest, and they were working with an efficiency that suggested they were being paid well and had a deadline. They were laughing, shouting over the noise of a portable generator and the whine of power drills. One of them, a big guy with a sunburned neck, was yelling about how Brenda wanted the west wall cleared before she arrived for the noon inspection. I just stood there, paralyzed by the sheer audacity of it all. I half expected a film director to pop out from behind a tractor and yell, "Cut!" But nothing happened. The men kept working. One of them noticed me, gave a dismissive 2-fingered wave, the kind you give someone you vaguely recognize but don't care about, and went right back to assembling a shelf. That dismissive wave was the spark that ignited the slow burn of anger deep in my chest. Today, clearly, was not going to be a normal day. Before we dive deeper into this unbelievable invasion of privacy and the fallout that followed, take a quick second and let me know down in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories of HOA insanity manage to travel. I approached the group slowly, deliberately keeping my hands visible and my posture relaxed. I wasn't looking for a physical confrontation. Not yet, anyway. I wanted information. "Morning, gentlemen," I said, keeping my voice level, conversational even. "Mind telling me exactly what you think you're doing here?" The guy with the sunburned neck, clearly the foreman, paused his drilling and looked over me. He squinted, wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, and shrugged, a gesture so casual it was insulting. "Just following orders, pal. Got a work order from Sunset Ridge Estates. Brenda signed off on it." "Brenda?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "The HOA President," he clarified, as if that explained everything. "She said this old shed was designated for the new community storage initiative, part of the neighborhood expansion plan. We got to have it ready by Saturday, so if you don't mind, we're kind of busy." He turned back to his work before I could even process the mountain of nonsense he just unloaded. Community storage, neighborhood expansion, Sunset Ridge Estates. Sunset Ridge Estates was a new development, a cluster of overpriced cookie-cutter McMansions that had sprung up about 5 miles down the valley 2 years ago. They were the kind of houses with pristine lawns, identical mailboxes, and apparently an HOA board drunk on their own perceived power. But they were 5 miles away. This barn, this land, was unequivocally, undeniably mine. The idea that their jurisdiction stretched this far into my ranch was laughable. But they weren't laughing. They were building. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't just a mistake. This was a deliberate, calculated land grab. Before I could formulate a response, the foreman's situation escalated. A gleaming, ridiculously expensive white Mercedes G-Wagon came bouncing down the dirt track, kicking up a rooster tail of dust, driving way too fast for the terrain. It screeched to a halt near the truck, and the driver's door swung open. Out stepped Brenda. It was like watching a caricature come to life.
She was dressed in pristine white yoga pants, expensive-looking hiking boots that had clearly never seen actual mud, and a puffy silver vest. Oversized designer sunglasses obscured half her face, and her blonde hair was pulled back so tightly it looked painful. And of course, she had the obligatory clipboard clutched in one hand like a royal scepter. She didn't walk, she marched. Every step radiated an aura of entitlement that screamed, "I am the main character, and you are merely an extra." She surveyed the workers' progress, nodding curtly, before her gaze landed on me. The smirk that spread across her face was practiced, condescending, and utterly infuriating. She strode over and, without so much as a hello or good morning, thrust a stapled packet of papers at my chest. "I assume you received the notice," she said, her voice crisp and devoid of any warmth. It was that syrupy, fake sweet tone that barely masked the steel underneath. "This structure has been formally requisitioned under the Sunset Ridge Beautification and Expansion Initiative, Article 4, Section B. It is now the Sunset Ridge Community Storage Facility." I took the papers and flipped through them slowly. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic nonsense. Pages of meaningless jargon, definitions of community improvement, and citations of HOA bylaws that had absolutely zero legal standing outside their little suburban bubble. There were no official county seals, no permits, and most importantly, my name and the actual legal address of my ranch were nowhere to be found. It looked like something printed off a home computer, complete with the HOA's cheesy logo, a stylized sunset over a cartoonish mountain ridge. I smiled, a slow, polite smile that I knew wouldn't reach my eyes, and handed the papers back to her. "Brenda, is it?" I said, keeping my tone light. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. You might want to double-check your geography. This land, this barn, this entire valley, it's not part of Sunset Ridge Estates." Her smile faltered just for a fraction of a second. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face before the mask of arrogance slammed back down. She tapped the clipboard with a perfectly manicured acrylic nail, the sharp click-click sound grating on my nerves. "The decision has already been finalized by the board," she said with an air of absolute finality, as if she were reading a death sentence. "The expansion boundaries were adjusted last quarter. If you have an issue, you are welcome to file a formal complaint at the next HOA meeting. It's the third Tuesday of the month." Behind her, a couple of the workers snickered, clearly emboldened by her presence and her faux authority. They looked at me like I was some ignorant hick who didn't understand the complexities of suburban governance. I stared at Brenda for a long, silent moment. The blood was pounding in my ears. I could have exploded. I could have started shouting, threatening, demanding they leave. I could have called the sheriff right then and there, and I would have been entirely justified. But something deep inside, a colder, more calculating part of my brain, told me to wait. There was an opportunity here, a delicious, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to let this woman destroy herself with her own arrogance. If I pushed back now, she might retreat, regroup, and try a more subtle approach. But if I let her think she was winning, if I let her commit fully to this illegal invasion, the fallout would be spectacular. Let her dig the hole deeper. Let her build the gallows herself. I forced a casual shrug, the most difficult physical act of my life. "All right, Brenda, if you say so." The relief that washed over her face was immediate and obvious. She beamed, misinterpreting my tactical retreat for complete surrender. She thought she had won. She thought I was just another pushover. "Excellent," she chirped, spinning on her heel with military precision. "Gentlemen," she barked at the workers, "let's pick up the pace. I want the first section operational by this evening." As I walked back toward my house, the old wooden boards of the porch groaning under my boots, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was overshadowed by a growing sense of anticipation. I pulled out my phone and started making calls. First to my lawyer, a shark in a tailored suit named Sarah, who lived for this kind of fight. Then to the county records office, and finally to an old friend, a grizzled land surveyor named Hank, who knew this valley better than anyone alive. If Brenda wanted a war, she was going to get one. She just had no idea that she had marched her troops onto a battlefield where I controlled the high ground, the supply lines, and the nuclear codes.
From the vantage point of my kitchen window, I watched the ongoing desecration of my barn. I poured myself a tall cup of black coffee, the bitter aroma filling the room, and sipped it slowly, a small, genuine grin playing on my lips for the first time that morning. Brenda was strutting around the site like a peacock, directing the workers with grand, sweeping gestures. She thought she was powerful because she controlled a neighborhood of identical houses with freshly painted fences and strict rules about the acceptable shade of beige for exterior trim. She thought she could march onto my land, 5 miles outside her jurisdiction, and claim it like some kind of suburban conquistador, planting her flag in the name of community improvement. What Brenda, in her infinite wisdom and meticulous planning, had failed to realize was that she wasn't just dealing with the owner of the barn. She had no clue that I owned the entire valley. Every square inch of land, from the entrance of her precious Sunset Ridge estates all the way to the river canyon 10 miles to the west, belonged to me. Every blade of grass, every towering pine tree, every fence post, every dusty cattle trail, it was all mine. My grandfather had bought this land decades ago, back when it was considered worthless, too remote, too rugged for development. It was an enormous tract of wilderness that nobody else wanted. We ran cattle on it, we lived simply, and we kept to ourselves. Over the years, as the city expanded and the suburbs crept closer, developers came sniffing around. 2 years ago, a development company made an offer on the southernmost section of the valley. It was a good offer, and the land was far from the main ranch complex. I sold it. That section became Sunset Ridge Estates. But here was the kicker, the delicious irony that was about to become the centerpiece of Brenda's downfall. When I sold that parcel, I retained ownership of all the surrounding land. Sunset Ridge Estates was an island of suburban sprawl in an ocean of my private property. They were completely landlocked. And critically, the only access road in and out of their development, the nice paved road they used every day to drive their G-Wagons to their yoga classes and board meetings, crossed a significant stretch of land that still belonged to me. I had granted an easement for access, of course, but it was a conditional easement, and the conditions were about to change. Brenda and her entire HOA were trapped, like rabbits in a snare, completely surrounded by land owned by the man whose property she was currently trying to steal. She had just made her number one enemy the gatekeeper of her entire existence. I leaned back in my chair and laughed, a deep, hearty sound that echoed in the quiet kitchen. This was going to be more than just interesting. This was going to be legendary. I spent the next hour on the phone with Sarah, my lawyer. When I explained the situation, the trespass, the unauthorized construction, the claim of jurisdiction, and the crucial detail about the land ownership, I could hear the excitement in her voice. "They actually built something?" she asked, her tone dripping with anticipation. "I've confirmed they're installing permanent shelving and repainting the interior as we speak." "Oh, this is beautiful," she practically purred. "Do not engage. Do not tell them to stop. Let them finish. Document everything. Photos, videos, receipts if you can find them. We want them to commit so many violations that the judge won't even have to deliberate. We're going to take them for everything they've got." The plan was set. Patience, documentation, and a slow, steady tightening of the noose. By late afternoon, the scene at my barn had escalated from a minor unauthorized construction project to a full-blown suburban circus. It was almost impressive, the speed and efficiency with which Brenda could manifest her delusional fantasies into reality. She had called in reinforcements. A landscaping crew, yes, a landscaping crew, on my ranch had shown up and started planting neat rows of petunias and marigolds around the entrance to the barn. They were even spreading mulch, the kind that's dyed an unnatural shade of red, contrasting jarringly with the dusty, sagebrush-covered ground. A massive vinyl banner had been strung up between the main doors, flapping loudly in the afternoon breeze. It read in cheerful Comic Sans-like font, "Future site of the Sunset Ridge Community Center. Welcome residents." It was surreal. I watched from the cover of the tree line, snapping photos and recording videos with my phone, documenting every new offense, every fresh layer of absurdity. Residents from Sunset Ridge Estates had started to trickle in, drawn by the noise and the promise of community improvement. They parked their expensive SUVs and crossovers haphazardly along the dirt track, completely blocking access to my own equipment sheds. They milled around, chatting excitedly, sipping lemonade from plastic cups provided by a small catering table Brenda had set up. I listened to their conversations, the snippets drifting over on the wind. "It's so wonderful that the board secured this space," one woman gushed. "We really needed somewhere for the kayaks and the Christmas decorations. And it's so rustic and charming, very authentic country living." It was mind-boggling. Nobody questioned it. Nobody wondered why their new community center was 5 miles away from their homes, down a rugged dirt road and a century-old barn that looked nothing like the modern beige architecture of their neighborhood. Nobody asked about permits or ownership or legality. They just accepted it because Brenda, their fearless leader, had said it was happening, and that was apparently enough. The power of the clipboard was absolute. I decided to take one last stroll over before the sun went down. I wanted to see the madness up close, to look Brenda in the eye one more time before I started dismantling her little kingdom. I sauntered over casually, hands deep in my pockets, whistling a lazy tune. The landscaping crew was packing up, admiring their handiwork. The construction workers were still inside the barn, the sound of drills echoing in the evening air. Brenda spotted me and immediately plastered on her brightest, most insincere smile, the kind of smile you give someone you've just stepped on but want to pretend was an accident. "Ah, glad to see you've come around," she chirped, her voice dripping with condescension. "It's amazing what a little hard work and community spirit can accomplish, isn't it?" I nodded slowly, pretending to admire the aggressively red mulch and the wilting petunias. "It's really something, Brenda. Impressive. You've all been so busy today." "We are planning the grand opening ceremony for Saturday, ribbon cutting, refreshments, the whole 9 yards. You're welcome to attend, of course." "Wouldn't miss it," I said, my tone flat but polite. "Enjoy it while you can." Her brow furrowed slightly. She sensed something in my tone, a subtle undercurrent of mockery that she didn't quite understand, but she was too busy playing Queen Bee, too intoxicated by her own perceived success to think too hard about it. She waved me off dismissively and went back to barking orders at a poor catering assistant who was struggling to light a portable heater. As I turned back toward my house, the last rays of the setting sun painted the barn in golden light. It looked almost peaceful, standing there at the center of the brewing storm. Little did Brenda know, the foundation she thought she was building wasn't just shaky, it was non-existent. The ground beneath her feet was about to crumble, and I was the one holding the detonator. Tomorrow, the real fun would begin. The next morning, I woke up before the alarm, a restless energy thrumming through me. The first phase of the operation was complete. Brenda had fully committed. She had trespassed, constructed, landscaped, and invited the public onto my property. Now it was time for phase 2, gathering the irrefutable proof that would seal her fate. I brewed a pot of coffee strong enough to wake the dead, grabbed a leather-bound notepad, and started compiling a checklist. Deeds, historical survey maps, tax records, the original sales agreement for the Sunset Ridge parcel, the easement documentation, anything and everything that legally tied the entire valley, including the barn and the access road, back to my family name. By 7:30 a.m., I was pulling out of the driveway in my old Ford pickup, heading straight to the county recorder's office downtown. The town is small, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone's business. The recorder's office was a dusty old building with faded paint and a perpetually flickering fluorescent light, but it held the keys to Brenda's upcoming disaster. The lady behind the counter was named Marge, an old family friend who had known my grandfather and had been working in that office longer than I had been alive. She was a sweet woman with a sharp mind and zero tolerance for nonsense. When she saw me, her face lit up in a warm smile. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," she greeted me. "Haven't seen you in a while. How's the ranch?" I leaned against the counter and explained the situation in a low voice, not wanting anyone in the small waiting area to overhear. Marge listened intently, her eyebrows climbing higher and higher as I detailed the events of the past 24 hours. The construction, the landscaping, the community storage center. When I finished, she let out a low whistle and shook her head, laughing under her breath. That new development crowd, they think they own the whole county. That Brenda woman, she came in here a few months ago demanding we update the county maps to reflect their expanded boundaries. Told her we don't take orders from HOAs. She must have a death wish messing with your family's land. She disappeared into the back room, the vault, where the historical records were kept. She returned 15 minutes later carrying a thick, heavy stack of folders and several rolled-up survey maps. "Here you go, honey," she said, spreading the documents out on the counter. "Everything you need." It was all there, deed after deed, survey after survey, all neatly stamped, recorded, and legally binding. The documents confirmed, in painstaking detail, the exact boundaries of my property. But Marge, bless her heart, had pulled something even juicier. The original survey maps from the 1950s, showing that the main access road used by Sunset Ridge Estates had originally been a private ranch road, long before the development existed. The easement agreement was clear. It granted access for residential traffic only, and it explicitly stated that the landowner, me, retained the right to control access and could revoke the easement if the terms were violated. Unauthorized construction and attempting to steal my barn certainly qualified as a violation. I thanked Marge profusely and promised to drop off a bushel of apples from the orchard later that week. With the documents secured and a locked briefcase in my truck, I made my next stop, the county land surveyor's office. My buddy Hank worked there. Hank was a man of few words, with a face like weathered leather and a dry wit. When I told him what was going on, he let out a bark of laughter that startled the secretary at the front desk. "Sounds like you got yourself a live one," he chuckled, shaking his head. "Suburbanites gone wild." He agreed to come out that afternoon, after his official duties were done, and mark off the true property boundaries with fresh survey flags and wooden stakes, just in case Brenda tried to claim confusion or ignorance later. "I'll make it so obvious," Hank promised, "that even a blind man could see the line." As I drove back to the ranch, the plan solidified in my mind. I wasn't going to storm over there and wave the deeds in Brenda's face. That would be too easy, too quick. I wanted her to keep digging, to keep piling up offenses, to keep escalating the absurdity until there was no way she could wriggle free. I would be patient. I would be methodical, and when the time was right, I would drop the hammer so hard that the shockwave would flatten Sunset Ridge Estates.
When I got back to the ranch, the situation had somehow managed to become even more ridiculous. The audacity was reaching new heights. Karen had brought in a portable toilet, a bright blue plastic monstrosity placed conspicuously near the barn entrance. The catering truck had returned, and now there were several picnic tables set up, covered in checkered tablecloths. A group of HOA members milled around, sipping iced tea and admiring the so-called community center. It looked like a poorly organized country fair had set up shop in my backyard without my permission. Hank showed up around noon in his battered pickup, his surveying equipment rattling in the bed. He gave a low whistle when he saw the circus unfolding at the barn. Good grief, they're really going all out, aren't they? He wasted no time getting to work. He unloaded his transit, his measuring tools, and bundles of bright orange survey flags. He started at the corner marker near the main road and began working his way along the true property line, planting a flag every 20 feet. Each flag was another nail in Brenda's coffin. The line he marked clearly showed that not only was the barn unequivocally on my property, but the dirt road leading up to it, the field surrounding it where they had set up the picnic tables, and even the little patch of trees Brenda had started referring to as Sunset Grove Park were all, without a shadow of a doubt, mine. While Hank worked, the HOA residents watched with mild curiosity but no alarm. They assumed it was just part of the project, perhaps marking out where the new parking lot would be paved. Brenda herself barely glanced at the flags, too busy barking orders into a headset she was now wearing like she was directing air traffic control. The level of delusion was staggering. One of her cronies, a man in salmon-colored shorts and boat shoes, actually tripped over one of the flags, cursed loudly, and then laughed it off, joking about how rustic the terrain was. I could barely contain my grin. They were so confident, so utterly blind to the trap they were walking into. If you're enjoying how this absolute disaster is unfolding for the HOA and you can't wait to see the final showdown, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to Keys and Chaos. We have plenty more stories of entitlement and instant karma coming your way. Things escalated quickly after the survey flags were set. It was as if Brenda, sensing that her time might be limited, decided to double down on her claim. Later that afternoon, a pair of self-proclaimed HOA security officers showed up. These were not real security guards. They were two middle-aged men dressed in matching dark blue polos with Sunset Ridge logo embroidered over the chest and security written in bold white letters on the back. They were armed with clipboards, two-way radios, and matching sunglasses, clearly feeling very official and very important. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud when one of them, a round man who looked like he hadn't done any physical activity since the Reagan administration, tried to jump over a shallow irrigation ditch and ended up face first in a puddle of muddy water. His partner helped him up, sputtering and covered in mud, while muttering about reporting the dangerous conditions of the terrain to the board. I stayed hidden, filming everything from a distance. It was painful to let them roam free like that, violating my privacy and my property rights, but it was necessary. Sarah, my lawyer, had made it crystal clear. Let them rack up the offenses. Let them incriminate themselves without your interference. Every minute they spend on your land without permission, every word they say about claiming authority is another layer of evidence for our eventual takedown. Feeling the need to assert her dominance even further, Brenda started installing temporary signs along the dirt road leading to the barn. Community Access Road, one read. Future home of Sunset Ridge Community Center, said another. I almost dropped my phone laughing when I saw the third one, placed right next to Hank's bright orange survey flag. Property of Sunset Ridge HOA, members only, trespassers will be prosecuted. The irony was thick, you could cut it with a knife. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck. She had no idea that each new sign, each new act of arrogance was setting her up for a crash so massive it would echo across the entire county. By the time the sun dipped below the hills, the barn had been completely transformed. String lights were hung from the rafters, the shelving units were fully assembled and already being loaded with storage bins, and a big chalkboard sign stood proudly out front listing upcoming HOA-sponsored events, starting with the grand opening gala on Saturday. It was absurd, ridiculous, and completely illegal. I sat on my porch that night, watching the barn glow in the dark, sipping a cold beer and letting the satisfaction sink in. Every ridiculous addition, every bold claim, every new footstep on my land was another weight dragging Brenda deeper into the quicksand she had so enthusiastically jumped into. Tomorrow, I would start tightening the noose a little bit more. A casual call to the local news station, a friendly tip to the sheriff's office about unauthorized construction and unpermitted gatherings, and maybe even a quiet conversation with the fire marshal about those electrical cords strung dangerously through the barn. The stage was set. The actors were in place. It was time for the final act.
The day of Brenda's grand opening gala dawned with a clear, bright blue sky, the kind of picture-perfect day that would make anyone think nothing could possibly go wrong. It was almost poetic. I woke up early, made a strong pot of coffee, and sat on my porch swing watching the final preparations unfold. The activity around the barn was frenetic. Workers were buzzing around like bees, setting up folding chairs, arranging flower displays, and testing a portable PA system that screeched with feedback. The parking area, which was actually my lower pasture, was filling up quickly with cars from the Sunset Ridge neighborhood. People dressed in their country casual best. Brand new jeans, pressed shirts, and expensive boots were trickling in, carrying coolers and picnic baskets. The atmosphere was festive, celebratory. They were all there to celebrate their victory, their successful acquisition of the new community center. Brenda was the center of it all, a whirlwind of activity and self-importance. She was wearing a bright red blazer over a white dress, looking like she was hosting a political rally. Her oversized sunglasses were firmly in place, and her hair was done up in an elaborate style that must have taken hours. She strutted around, shaking hands, kissing cheeks, posing for pictures, and barking orders into her headset. She was the queen bee, surveying her kingdom, basking in the adoration of her subjects. It was such a grand performance, such a meticulously crafted fantasy that I almost hated to ruin it. Almost. Around 10 a.m., the first piece of the puzzle clicked into place. A local news van from Channel 7 Action News rolled up quietly,
parking near the main road. I had tipped them off the night before, promising them a story about HOA overreach and a dramatic confrontation. A young, eager reporter and a cameraman got out, pretending to be just another couple attending the event. I waved discreetly at them from my porch. I had provided them with a full packet of documents earlier that morning: property deeds, survey maps, and a timeline of Brenda's unauthorized activities. They knew exactly what was about to go down, and they were hungry for the footage. Right behind the news van, the second piece arrived. 2 Sheriff's Department cruisers pulled up, lights flashing but sirens silent. 4 deputies in crisp uniforms stepped out and began surveying the scene. I had called the sheriff that morning, explaining that I needed assistance removing a large group of trespassers from my property and that things might get heated. The deputies moved slowly, deliberately, observing everything without rushing. They were making notes, taking pictures, establishing the scene. Brenda, lost in her own world of self-congratulation, was too busy soaking up the attention of her HOA friends to notice the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. At exactly 11 a.m., the so-called ceremony began. The music faded, and Brenda took the stage, a small, elevated platform they had built near the barn entrance. She tapped the microphone, clearing her throat dramatically, and launched into her speech. It was a masterpiece of self-serving nonsense. She talked about community spirit, togetherness, and the power of proactive leadership. She praised the residents for their support, thanked the board members by name for their vision and dedication, and even hinted at running for county commissioner someday. "Today we celebrate more than just a new storage facility," she declared, gesturing grandly at the barn. "We celebrate the expansion of our community, the realization of our vision for a better, more connected Sunset Ridge." The crowd clapped and cheered enthusiastically, completely oblivious to the reality of the situation. They were eating it up, hanging on her every word. Just as she was winding down, preparing for the ribbon cutting, I made my move. I stepped off the porch and started walking calmly, deliberately towards the barn. I wasn't alone. Beside me walked Sarah, my lawyer, looking sharp and professional, holding a thick manila folder under one arm. Hank the surveyor and Marge from the records office, who had agreed to serve as witnesses, followed a few steps behind. And the 4 sheriff's deputies fanned out, flanking us, their presence suddenly very obvious. As we approached the crowd, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Conversation stopped, heads turned, the cheerful music died down. A wave of confusion and uncertainty rippled through the assembled residents. Brenda frowned, confused at first, then visibly irritated by the interruption. She leaned into the microphone, her voice dripping with annoyance. "Excuse me," she said sharply, the fake sweetness gone. "This is a private event. If you are not a resident of Sunset Ridge Estates, you need to leave immediately." I stopped a few feet away from the stage, smiling pleasantly. The news camera subtly shifted position, ensuring they had a clear shot of Brenda's face. "I think you'll want to hear what we have to say, Brenda," I replied, my voice loud enough to carry across the silent crowd.
I turned to Sarah, who stepped forward, opened the folder, and pulled out several official-looking documents. In a loud, clear voice, projecting like the seasoned courtroom litigator she was, she addressed Brenda directly. "Mrs. Brenda Sterling," Sarah announced, "you and the Sunset Ridge Homeowners Association are hereby served with a formal cease and desist order for gross trespass, unauthorized construction, vandalism, conversion of property, and illegal use of private land." There was a stunned silence, broken only by the clicking of the news camera and the hushed, horrified whispers of the crowd. Brenda's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Her face, usually tanned and perfectly made up, turned a sickly shade of pale. She stared at the documents in Sarah's hand as if they were venomous snakes. This is outrageous," she stammered, her voice trembling. "This is HOA property. We have the permits. We have the authorization." "You have no permits, Mrs. Sterling. You have no authorization. This property belongs to my client, as do the 5 miles of land surrounding this barn in every direction." Sarah handed the cease and desist papers directly to Brenda, who took them with shaking hands. The sheriff's deputies stepped forward then, addressing the crowd.
"Ladies and gentlemen," the senior deputy announced, his voice booming with authority, "this is private property. The event is over. You need to collect your belongings and leave the premises immediately. Any further activity on this property will result in immediate arrest for trespassing." The color drained completely from Brenda's face. For a moment, it looked like she might argue, might try to rally her supporters. But then she caught sight of the news camera, the red light blinking, aimed squarely at her. She realized, finally, the magnitude of the disaster unfolding around her. The realization broke her. The mask of arrogance shattered, revealing the terrified, entitled bully underneath. She turned an alarming shade of crimson and began shrieking. "This is unfair," she screamed, her voice rising higher and higher until it cracked, echoing off the barn walls. "I have worked tirelessly for this community. I was only trying to improve our neighborhood. He's being selfish, petty. He doesn't even use this barn." It was a full-blown meltdown, a spectacular display of narcissistic rage and public humiliation. People in the crowd began backing away, horrified and embarrassed. Some pulled out their phones to record the meltdown, the footage destined for social media immortality. Others simply turned and walked off, wanting no part of the disaster unfolding before them. One elderly lady, a resident I recognized from the neighborhood, shook her head sadly and muttered under her breath, "I knew she was flying too close to the sun." Brenda's tirade ended with her throwing the cease and desist papers to the ground in a dramatic gesture of defiance and storming off toward her G-Wagon, muttering about calling her lawyer and filing a countersuit that would bury this hick town. The sheriff's deputies followed her calmly, explaining that leaving was her best option if she wanted to avoid being arrested for disturbing the peace. She scrambled into her car and sped off, kicking up a cloud of dust and leaving her stunned supporters to fend for themselves. With the main drama over, the crowd dispersed quickly. It was a shamefaced retreat. Some of the HOA members tried to act like they had no idea what was going on, muttering about being misled by the board. Others were simply embarrassed, heads down as they shuffled back to their vehicles, their country casual outfits suddenly looking ridiculous. The news crew caught it all, from Brenda's grandiose speech to her spectacular meltdown and the awkward retreat of her former supporters. They interviewed Sarah, who gave a concise, damning summary of the legal situation. They even interviewed a few disgruntled residents who were already talking about recalling the board. Sarah and I stayed behind to oversee the removal of the unauthorized signage and equipment. The deputies supervised while the catering staff and the remaining workers dismantled the makeshift welcome booths, pulled down the banners, and loaded everything back into their trucks. The construction foreman, the guy with the sunburned neck, actually apologized to me as he left. "We had no idea, man. We just followed the work order. Brenda said it was all approved." By late afternoon, the barn was once again empty, save for the newly installed shelving units, which I decided to keep, a small consolation prize, and a few stray balloons drifting across the dusty ground. As I walked back to my house, I couldn't help but feel a deep, profound sense of satisfaction. It had been a long game, requiring patience, restraint, and meticulous planning. But the payoff was worth every second. Brenda had tried to steamroll me with arrogance and bluster, and in the end, she had destroyed herself, publicly and completely, without me ever having to raise my voice. That evening, the local news ran the story as the lead segment. The footage was brutal. They showed Brenda's meltdown in full, glorious detail, freeze-framing on her enraged, contorted face. The segment ended with a cheerful note about the importance of respecting private property rights and the consequences of unchecked entitlement. I received texts and phone calls from friends and neighbors all night, most of them laughing, some congratulating me, a few asking if they could stop by for a celebratory drink. The battle was won, but the war wasn't quite over. I knew Brenda well enough to expect some retaliation, some desperate attempt to save face, and I'd be ready.
The next few days after the disastrous barn event were strangely quiet, almost too quiet. I knew Brenda was still out there, licking her wounds, plotting her revenge, trying to find some way to claw back her lost pride and reputation. But on the surface, Sunset Ridge Estates had gone into lockdown. I used the silence wisely, putting the next phase of my plan into motion. It was time to secure the perimeter. First, I called in a trusted local fencing company and scheduled an emergency installation. I didn't want just any fence. I wanted a statement. Within 2 days, a crew was out there installing a brand new 8-foot-tall, heavy-duty barbed wire fence along the entire perimeter of my property bordering the development. It was an aggressive move, perhaps, but a necessary one. I wanted to send a clear, unmistakable message. The playground was closed. Permanently. Every 50 feet, I made sure a new "No Trespassing" sign was posted, bold and intimidating. Private ranch property. Access forbidden without written consent. Violators will be prosecuted. As the fence took shape, I could see the residents of Sunset Ridge peering out from behind their manicured hedges, whispering among themselves. The fence was ruining their view, disrupting their sense of openness. A few even had the nerve to walk up to the workers and complain, asking what was happening, claiming the fence was unsightly. The workers, polite but firm, simply pointed to the signs and said they were following the owner's orders. Brenda made her move on the 3rd day. She came marching up the access road, flanked by 2 other board members who looked like hostages, their faces pale and strained. Her face was set in a mask of forced confidence, but I could see the cracks beneath the surface. Her hands twitched at her sides, and she kept glancing nervously at the new security cameras I had mounted on my porch and barn. She was trying to project power, but all I saw was desperation. She stopped just short of the new fence line and called out to me. I was standing on my porch, arms crossed, enjoying the show. "We need to talk," she demanded, her voice loud and shrill. "This fence is unacceptable, and we need to discuss the community's access rights." I walked slowly toward her, taking my time, making her wait. When I reached the fence, I leaned casually against one of the posts and raised an eyebrow. "I don't think we have anything to discuss, Brenda," I said, my voice calm and steady. "This is private property. Always has been, always will be. You and your HOA have no rights here." Brenda's face flushed a deep, angry red. She pulled a folder from under her arm and waved it at me, the papers flapping in the breeze. "We have historical easements," she insisted, her voice rising. "The community has always used this land for recreation. You're cutting us off. You are causing hardship. We will sue." I chuckled, a low sound that seemed to unsettle the board members flanking her. "If you had legal easements, Brenda, your lawyer would have presented them. You had your chance. You tried to steal my land and you failed. Now you're trespassing again. I suggest you turn around and leave before I have the sheriff escort you out again." Brenda sputtered, trying to form a coherent argument, but the words caught in her throat. She was trapped, both literally and metaphorically, and she knew it. Finally, one of the board members muttered something to her and tugged at her sleeve. She hesitated, glaring at me with pure, unadulterated hatred, but then turned sharply and marched back down the road, her minions scrambling to keep up. I knew that wouldn't be the end of it. True to form, Brenda spent the next week trying every petty trick in the book. She sent passive-aggressive letters accusing me of harming community morale and destroying property values. She tried rallying the HOA members to file complaints with the county about my fence, claiming it was hazardous and violated zoning ordinances. She even went so far as to leave a handwritten note in my mailbox offering to buy a strip of land for a new community access road, promising generous compensation. I ignored the letters, documented everything, and made sure Sarah had copies of each new stunt.
I made life just a little harder for the HOA. I installed heavy-duty gates on every access point along the fence line, locking them securely. I put up motion sensor floodlights that bathe the boundary lines in bright light at night, making it impossible for anyone to sneak across without being seen. The final straw came when I received a frantic call from Sarah. She had been tipped off that Brenda was planning a secret emergency HOA meeting to vote on whether to pursue legal action against me for the so-called access hardship and the fence. It was laughable. They had no case, no documentation, no legal standing. But I knew Brenda well enough to realize she wouldn't stop until she had burned every bridge and exhausted every resource. Sarah advised me to attend the meeting. "It's a public meeting technically," she said, "and we need to make sure everything is properly recorded. Your presence alone might be enough to stop the madness." So, a few nights later, I found myself standing at the back of the Sunset Ridge Community Center, their actual one this time, arms folded, listening as Brenda tried to rally the residents one last time. She stood at the front of the room, gesturing wildly, painting me as a villain, a heartless land baron who had cruelly cut them off for no good reason. She was hysterical, desperate, her voice cracking with emotion. But something had changed. The residents weren't buying it anymore. The news story, the public humiliation, the realization of how close they had come to a massive lawsuit, it had all soured them on Brenda's leadership. Murmurs of dissent rippled through the crowd. A few people stood up and challenged her claims, asking for proof of the easements, questioning why she hadn't gotten proper permits for the barn project in the first place. "You wasted our HOA dues on an illegal project, Brenda, and now you want us to spend more money on a frivolous lawsuit?" Karen grew more frantic with each passing minute, her arguments crumbling, her support evaporating. Finally, the HOA vice president, one of the men who had flanked her at the fence line, stood up and called for a vote. Should the HOA pursue legal action, or should they formally recognize the property boundaries and drop the matter entirely? When the results were tallied, it wasn't even close. An overwhelming majority voted to drop the issue entirely. Brenda stood frozen at the front of the room, staring at the results in disbelief. Her reign was over. She had been dethroned by her own people.
The aftermath of Brenda's downfall rippled through the neighborhood like a shockwave. Word had spread far beyond Sunset Ridge Estates. People in nearby towns were talking about the outrageous attempt to seize a barn and the spectacular way it had all blown up in the HOA's face. The local newspaper ran a front-page story titled "The Battle of Sunset Ridge," complete with a picture of Brenda mid-tantrum during the barn event. It was a masterpiece of journalism, and for once, they had gotten every detail right. Brenda became a ghost. The once proud queen bee who had marched around with a clipboard and a headset now darted from her house to her car with her head down, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Rumors swirled that she was facing legal action from residents furious about the money wasted on the fake community center project. At the next official HOA meeting, which I attended purely for amusement, Brenda was formally removed from her position as HOA President by a unanimous vote. She didn't even show up to defend herself. A quiet, reasonable man named Mr. Davidson was elected to take her place. His first official act was to issue a formal apology to me on behalf of the Sunset Ridge HOA. The apology came with a signed document affirming that the HOA recognized my property boundaries and would have no further interaction with or claim over any part of my ranch. It was over, officially and completely. Once the dust settled, I decided it was time to move on and reclaim my peace. I held a small gathering at the ranch, inviting Hank, Marge, Sarah, and a few close friends who had stood by me during the chaos. We grilled steaks over an open fire, drank cold beer, and laughed long into the night about the absurdity of it all. Hank retold the story of the security guard falling into the irrigation ditch so many times that by the end of the night it had grown into a full-fledged legend. At some point during the evening, someone suggested that I should put up a permanent sign on the barn as a reminder of what had happened. After a few more beers and a lot of laughter, we came up with the perfect idea.
A week later, a large, professionally made wooden sign was installed right above the barn doors. It read, "Private Property, Est 1925," and below it, a simple silhouette of a woman with wild hair waving a clipboard enclosed in a red circle with a line through it. Tasteful, but obvious. Life slowly returned to normal. The fields grew tall with new grass, the cattle grazed peacefully, and the barn stood quiet and sturdy, just as it always had. As for Brenda, she eventually sold her house and moved away. I heard she put it on the market quietly, accepting the first decent offer she got. Nobody threw a going-away party. One day, she was just gone, like a bad dream that fades with the morning light. Sitting on my porch one evening, watching the sun dip low over the hills, I thought about everything that had happened. It would have been easy to let anger consume me when Brenda first invaded my barn. It would have been easy to shout, to threaten, to lose my temper. But by staying calm, by being patient, by letting her show her true colors in front of everyone, I had won more completely than I ever could have by force. She had destroyed herself with her own arrogance and pride. There was a deep lesson in that. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's simply standing your ground, knowing you're right, and letting the truth shine through. Bullies like Brenda build their empires on intimidation and lies, but truth, patience, and a little strategic planning can topple the grandest castles built on sand. The ranch was mine, and would always be mine. And no one, not Brenda or any other would-be tyrant, would ever take that away from me. And that's how you handle an HOA tyrant who doesn't understand boundaries. Thanks for sticking around to the end of this saga. If this story satisfied that craving for justice, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more stories from Keys and Chaos. See you in the next one.